Hello. In my last two videos, I discussed aggregate demand curve, short-run aggregate supply curve, and long-run aggregate supply curve. Now, in this video, I will explain recessionary and inflationary gaps by drawing all those three curves, that is aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply, and long-run aggregate supply curves in one diagram. So this is the diagram where you can see aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. We know why aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. We also know what are the factors that shift aggregate demand curve rightward or leftward. The aggregate supply curve is also given as an upward sloping line. And then we have a long run aggregate supply curve as well. This time, instead of writing LAS, I just wrote potential GDP. That is, this is the full employment level of output of this country. I have taken real GDP on the horizontal axis and price level, that is GDP deflator, on the vertical axis. This situation is called full employment equilibrium. By full employment equilibrium, I mean that the intersection of aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves, that is, both curves will intersect at full employment level of output. So we have equilibrium, and this equilibrium is actually at full employment level of output. That is why we are saying full employment equilibrium. By equilibrium, I mean when aggregate demand equals aggregate supply. So when aggregate demand curve intersects aggregate supply curve, that is, that point of intersection is equilibrium. If this equilibrium is at the full employment also, this is called full employment equilibrium. So this is what is written here. If the equilibrium occurs at the level of long run aggregate supply, the economy is at full employment equilibrium. Now, once you know this full employment equilibrium situation, then we discuss these two gaps, that is recessionary gap and inflationary gap. Because all the time it is not necessary that you have equilibrium real GDP, which is also at full employment. Sometimes you have less than full employment equilibrium point, and sometimes you have more than full employment equilibrium point. How come a country can produce more than full employment? Because by full employment, I don't mean unemployment equal to zero. By full employment, I mean only cyclical unemployment equal to zero. So we still have frictional and structural unemployment that is, around 5 to 7%. So it is possible that you can reduce these two types of unemployment, that is natural rate of unemployment, and produce slightly more than full employment level of output. So let me show you the next diagram. This diagram clearly shows a recessionary gap. By recessionary gap, I mean, look at this diagram. Recessionary gap, look at the equilibrium. The equilibrium is at YE at this point, at YE. YE means real GDP equilibrium. So this is the equilibrium real GDP. But full employment GDP of this country is YFE, which is higher than the equilibrium point. So this gap, the distance between these 2 points, that is YE and YFE, is called a recessionary gap. That is, this economy is experiencing recession. And by recession, I mean basically unemployment. So we have a problem of unemployment in this case. Let me read this out. A recessionary gap shows a condition where actual real GDP, by actual real GDP, I mean equilibrium GDP, where AS and AD intersects. Where, AD, that is aggregate demand, and aggregate supply intersect, is less than potential. And by potential, I mean full employment level of GDP. So you can see YE is less than YFE. It shows cyclical unemployment in the country. So we do have some unemployment in the country, not frictional or structural, but cyclical unemployment. Because if we have zero cyclical unemployment, then we would be operating, our equilibrium would be exactly at YFE. This is what we call full employment equilibrium that I showed you in the previous slide. If this occurs for 2 consecutive quarters, it is called a recession. So basically, if you have this cyclical unemployment for first quarter only, we don't call it recession. But if you have this unemployment consecutively for 2 quarters, then we say that the economy is in recession. And by recession, I mean basically unemployment, cyclical unemployment. The other option is inflationary gap. So notice in this diagram, the only difference is that this country is producing at YE, which is higher than YFE. So we have technically overemployment in the country. So basically, we are hiring workers who are frictionally and structurally unemployed. So it's very difficult for employers to find workers because the economy is operating at overemployment. What is the impact? The impact would be increase in price level. So inflation will occur if this is the situation. And that is why this gap is called inflationary gap. So an inflationary gap shows a condition where actual real GDP, that is equilibrium GDP, YE, is higher than potential. By potential, I mean full employment GDP or real GDP. So it shows inflation. So we have inflation in this country, if this is the diagram. And you know, if so either you have the problem of unemployment, that is the economy is producing less than the full employment level of output, or you have employment or employment if the economy is producing more than full employment. So in this case, we have a problem of inflation, and in recessionary gap, we have a problem of unemployment. Now, if you look at this diagram, so what I've done, let me go back here first. This is the diagram for inflationary gap. And you know what is inflationary gap. By inflationary gap, I mean when actual GDP, real GDP is higher than full employment real GDP. Now, we start from the full employment. Don't get confused, and let me discuss this. I will start with the full employment equilibrium. So just consider AD1 curve, that is aggregate demand curve, and AS1 curve, and potential GDP. So these 3 curves will give you equilibrium, full employment equilibrium. That is YE, equilibrium income, is also equal to YFE. There's no problem of inflation. There's no problem of unemployment. The economy is operating at full employment. There's no cyclical unemployment. That is the best situation. Now suppose if demand or aggregate demand curve shifts to the right. So if demand shifts rightward, by demand, I don't mean demand for one specific product. This is aggregate demand, overall demand for all goods and services, demanded by all these 4 buyers, consumers, investors, government, and foreigners. So what would happen if demand shifts rightward? If demand curve shifts to the right, you know, maybe because people have more income, maybe because of business expectation, whatever be the reason, if demand shifts to the right. So I want you to know that using this diagram, I just conclude 2 important things. Number 1, when I shift the aggregate demand curve to the right from AD1 to AD2, and this rightward arrow shows the demand curve, aggregate demand curve is shifting to the right, the new equilibrium will be at the intersection of new aggregate demand and same aggregate supply because there's no change in aggregate supply curve, AS1 curve. So new equilibrium, notice that is higher than full employment level of GDP. Full employment, that is potential GDP, this vertical green line is not changing, just demand curve shifts to the right. So if this is the case, notice there are two things happening. First, now this country is producing more than full employment level of output. That is the case of inflationary gap. And notice what is happening to price index. Price index is also increasing from P1 to P2. So we have inflation in the country. This inflation is called demand pull inflation. Why demand pull inflation? Because price index is increasing because of the increase in demand. Because people, consumers, or buyers, let me put this way, buyers are demanding more. And because of this excessive demand, prices are soaring. So this type of inflation is called demand pull inflation. But remember, we are measuring inflation here in using GDP deflator, but we normally measure inflation using consumer price index. Now the same thing, this time I started with the same diagram, that is aggregate demand 1, aggregate supply 1, and potential GDP. The economy is operating at full employment equilibrium. There's no problem. Everything is fine. Cyclical unemployment equals 0. Now suppose if there's a short run aggregate supply curve shifts leftward. Let's say because of supply chain issues during COVID, the cost of production has gone up because of this issue, that is COVID-19. So this increase in cost of production will actually shift the aggregate supply curve to the left. Suppliers are producing less because cost of production has gone up because of this supply chain bottlenecks due to COVID. So when I shift the aggregate supply curve to the left from AS1 to AS2, notice what is happening. The actual GDP, that is equilibrium GDP, is decreasing to Y1, from YE to Y1. So this Y1 is definitely less than full employment level of real GDP. So we have a recessionary gap. So we have unemployment in the country because of the shift in aggregate supply curve. There's no change in potential GDP, no change in long run aggregate supply curve. Only short run aggregate supply is shifting to the left because of supply chain bottlenecks due to COVID-19, suppose. And also notice price index is also increasing. So we have inflation as well. So prices are increasing. At the same time, we have unemployment in the economy. This inflation is called cost push inflation. So when prices are soaring because of increase in cost of production, that is called cost push inflation. Although we do not calculate inflation using GDP deflator, but we can explain the same thing using consumer price index as well. That is, if we have inflation because of increase in demand, that is called demand pull inflation using consumer price indices. And if the prices of all these consumer goods and services, the basket of all those fixed goods and consumer goods and services, if these prices are increasing because of the supply shortages, because of the increase in cost of production, then we call it cost push inflation. And finally, what I have done in this diagram, so notice that I'm using aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. Technically, I'm using only 3 curves: aggregate demand curve, aggregate supply curve, and long run aggregate supply curve. And we are just defining different terms: cost push inflation, demand pull inflation, recessionary gap, inflationary gap, unemployment, inflation. So these are all concepts that we are discussing using just these 3 diagrams. This is what we call aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. Look at this, another case. This time I started with the full employment equilibrium level of equilibrium. That is LAS1 curve, AD1 curve, and AS1 curve. Just initially, so all one, LS1, LAS1, AD1, and AS1, we have full employment equilibrium. Suppose if the country's capacity to produce increases, let's say we find oil reserves, or let's say we find reserves, coal reserves, or gold mines, or whatever. So of course, the country's capacity to produce will increase, and therefore this long run aggregate supply curve will shift to the right. I discussed earlier in my other videos that when you shift long run aggregate supply to the right, short run aggregate supply must also shift to the right by the same amount. And look at these two horizontal blue circle. So I have shifted AS and LAS curves in such a way that the distance between these two curves is same. So when I shifted AS curve to the right as well and LAS curve to the right, notice the new equilibrium. And I told you by equilibrium, I mean the intersection of AS and AD. That's all. So there's no change in AD. So I'll just take AD1 curve, which is the same. And now I take the new AS2 curve. Notice this AS2 curve and AD1 curve, they are intersecting at point E. So point E is the equilibrium point. So Y2 is the equilibrium point. But notice Y3 is the full employment level of GDP, real GDP. How do I know? Because at Y3, I have long run aggregate supply curve, new aggregate supply curve, long run, LAS2 curve. So full employment is Y3 after this shift, but real GDP is only Y2. This creates a recessionary gap. How do I know a recessionary gap? Because your actual output is Y2, whereas your full employment output is Y3. So you are producing less than the full employment. So this gap is called recessionary gap. That is Y2 minus Y1. And also notice that price index is decreasing. So prices are decreasing. So if we have new invention, if we have new natural resources, then it will exert pressure, downward pressure on price index. But it will create unemployment as well. So because we have a recessionary gap, so we have unemployment, but at the same time, prices are also decreasing. So we can analyze these types of, basically explain these types of concepts easily using aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. Thank you.